Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be our first Netflix Avatar The Last Airbender episode review roundtable extravaganza. In this one, we're going to be reviewing the first episode of Netflix Avatar, and that is, I'm going to call it N101 Aang. And then that's the way we're going to be doing these podcasts. It'll be one Netflix Avatar episode per review podcast. And yes, I am your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg 2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So we are here. Netflix Avatar has been out. This is day 3, basically. And I have seen it all. Greg, you have seen the first 2 episodes so far, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. So that's going to be kind of our approach here. During this sort of recording session, we're going to record the reviews for the first 2 episodes, and it'll go on over the course of as long as it takes to cover them, of course. There's a lot of material here. This is the kind of struggle, I suppose, with it releasing all at once, is that there's a lot of stuff to try and get through, and we do want to focus in on all of the episodes, of course. But yeah, let's jump in here. So yeah, N101 is Aang, and we'll before we get into the details of this episode, I think we just have to give some general kind of thoughts here on just seeing Netflix Avatar for more or less the first time. Of course, we've seen quite a bit of it over the marketing and all the pictures and the clips. There was quite a few clips by launch day, but it still felt like ultimately we needed the full episode to actually get a proper sense for what it was. So I suppose just what was your thoughts kind of just starting this opening episode and finally, after all this time, announced back in 2018, finally getting to watch Netflix Avatar?
Yeah, it definitely was something to behold, to see it in this sort of full entirety and not sort of in like the snippets and sort of the behind the scenes of sort of the marketing and reading some of the articles, not all of them. I didn't read everything, like I'm sure you tried to get through most of it, but it definitely gives you I guess a different sense of actually seeing the first episode or first couple episodes compared to just seeing like even just say like the trailer and stuff, since that is it's different things that they're focusing on in the trailer to sort of to get you enticed into watching and whatnot. So it definitely is a different perspective of actually seeing the first 2 episodes, for me at least, and compared to the trailer, and what things that I actually like more now that I've actually seen the episodes, and what things I think I like less than from seeing the trailer. So some things have definitely changed from my perspective, at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was definitely interesting for me, like just having pretty much seen everything in the marketing, and then like yes, there is clearly stuff that they kind of hadn't really kind of been showing us. There's stuff that very clearly they had been, and it was just like I think I was fully prepared for it because I think I had my head in the right space kind of going into the episode where because I've never been the most hyped for live action Avatar, it allowed me to kind of be like, hey, this is actually pretty good, but there are still problems, and it's perfectly fine, which I suppose is the big thing to get into just now, and that is just initial impressions on. I suppose we'll just basically what we've seen. I won't get into spoilers for the remaining episodes you haven't seen, but from the first 2 that you've seen, Greg, what are your overall impressions of this attempt at live action Avatar?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, not being so maybe as beholden to the original series as other people who might have been a bit younger than me when I saw it, I think, these first 2 episodes that I've seen have been perfectly fine for me. I mean, I'm not like, praising it as sort of like the next coming of the next greatest, live action show, or anything like that. But I think for what I've seen so far and what they've been trying to achieve, that for the most part, it works for me. I think, the changes that they have done, which we knew they were going to do, and some of those got blown more out of proportion and others, sort of got thrown to the wayside. I think for me, most of it worked. It feels like a rather sort of, good conversion towards sort of the live action mentality of a TV show and what sort of things, work better in live action than they do sort of in a cartoon, sort of almost sort of comedic sort of way. Not to say that there isn't, some fun bits here and there in these episodes, but it definitely feels like, at least to me, it feels like it's more grounded in reality compared to, say, the cartoon would be, or at least for the way that they sort of slanted the original sort of cartoon series. So for me, from what I've seen so far, it works fine enough. Would it be something that I would necessarily like, try to rush out and see if it didn't have the name Avatar attached to it? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not, but I don't think I watch as many, live action series as other people do. So that might just be my sort of personal preference in that sort of regard. But I think from what I've seen, it's worked fine enough. I was definitely intrigued to see the first two episodes, and I've rewatched them, of course, for this review. So I've seen them a couple times at this point, and they've been able to hold my attention. So for what that's worth, it definitely has achieved that.
Mm. Yeah, and my thoughts are pretty similar. Like I think like overall, I think that this live action version is pretty good. Like there's definitely flaws to get into as you kind of will go through the episodes here. These ones, some of the episodes you haven't seen yet, but it's of a kind of quality that is fine. It's what I kind of more or less expected and what I wanted, and I think it's of a useful kind of level. Like it works as I think the live action kind of gateway into the franchise that the movie could never fully be. Though interestingly, the movie did bring in new fans, and I think this will be much better at that because it has been better received. Um, and now obviously like the thing with this is obviously we have to get into discussion and we'll go through it here, like the changes, like why did they make this change, which are the good changes, which are the bad changes, and all that sort of stuff. And there's always going to be discussions either way in terms of is this right, is this wrong. But that's the whole point of now taking the time to actually discuss it now that it is finally out, because we have full context for everything. But in general, I definitely lean pretty positive overall. I'm probably like overall in or around like a 7 out of 10 in terms of my like overall kind of score for the series. But so far these first two episodes are the only ones I've rewatched. I definitely need to watch the other episodes another time. So, I suppose I think everything else we can just kind of discuss as we go through the episode here. So, we'll start here, N101, Aang. And of course, as we basically knew, we start with a full-on new sequence that we don't have in the original. And this, what's so interesting about this is that this is like a 20-minute completely new sequence, all set like just prior to Sozin's Comet, the arrival of Sozin's Comet, ending of course with basically the death of Gyatso and Aang becoming trapped in the ice. I suppose like we'll go through it here, but just because it's such a notable new sequence here, just I suppose do a general thing just on this bit. What were your thoughts on this giant opening sequence here and how long it went?
Yeah, no, this was, I mean, I thought it was cool. I mean, I think, it could be, I could see how this could be like hit or miss or too much for some people depending on your sort of, personal preference on this sort of thing. But for me, and I think we knew like a little bit about this, or we heard like rumblings of this, that this was going to be a thing. So to actually get to see it in its entirety, I thought was pretty interesting. I thought it was pretty cool. I mean, this is one of those things that like from the original series, like we don't really have a lot of information on at all. Like, I mean, like most of the time it's like, you have to like dig deep into stuff and like the card game and like some other stuff and bits and pieces for interviews and stuff that Mike and Brian have said over, the course of, the 2 decades plus that the show's been out, in order to sort of get sort of a general sort of understanding of what's happening, but to actually see it here, see sort of the sort of like espionage and sort of the spy stuff, and how that all sort of like pieced together, I thought that was pretty interesting. I definitely could see how some of this could be, the direction that they took in things and how they visually chose to display it. I could see that being a bit sort of hit or miss on people, but from my perspective, I thought it was, pretty cool to actually be able to get to see this. I mean, it's not like a nice thing. It's pretty heartbreaking to actually see it in, its sort of entirety here. So there's definitely that sort of, aspect to consider when you're seeing this and sort of, who might, want to watch these sort of sequence of events. But I thought it was, interesting and cool to see how, their perspective of how this sort of played out in the beginning of everything and how, the war actually began.
hmm Yeah, like I completely get doing this because I think we as fans have always wanted to know more details about the Enroma genocide in the original content, and we still have vague, scattered information. Like the RPG maybe like clarified it like a little bit more, and we'll get into like what the differences are when we go through it here. Um, but this is obviously a different attempt at that, but it's still cool to get to see it because just any of this stuff that's in like the other eras of Avatar is always interesting to get. So like, ooh, Sozin's here. That's really interesting. Here's Gyatso outside of scenes with Aang. Like all this stuff actually like works together pretty nicely to just present like, okay, here's a little bit of a political intrigue thing. I think it's a reasonable thing here to highlight, showing you some of the start of the war. Um, and it's one of those things where, like, I don't think it's a problem that the original doesn't show the Air genocide because it being this mysterious thing that you only know the results of, but it's implied what happened, has impact as well with how good the original is written. But it's nice to see some of this for sure. Maybe it's a little bit too long for how much maybe information actually like comes across from it, and like there could have been maybe more information, and especially I think with having seen the whole thing where some of the cuts happen in later episodes, you kind of feel like could the budget or time have been like assigned slightly differently a little bit, because this first episode's pretty packed because we cover effectively this whole new backstory episode 1, episode 2, and like part of episode 3. It's a lot trying to fit it in here, even though it's like an hour long episode. But we'll get into it here. We'll start the recap here. So we start off with the comet. At this point, I suppose the Great Comet, but we're about to see why it becomes known as Sozin's Comet. But then we cut into the Fire Nation capital city to see this Earthbender spy character running away from Fire Nation soldiers. He has this message, and on the message is basically a note to the Earth King to say that the Fire Nation is about to start a war specifically against the Earth Kingdom. An attack is incoming. We get a really cool action sequence that's like part chase, but then as he's about to hand it off to a messenger on an ostrich horse, he is forced to sort of stand his ground and fight. He gets the message away, but he does get captured after a pretty, strong fight here. But of course, he does get captured, and we'll address what happens to him in the following scene here. But very interesting way to open up here. I do wish they had named this Earthbender spy character. I don't think even in the credits he gets a name, but still it was an interesting showcase here to kind of highlight some of the subterfuge going on about how the nations started to hear about the Fire Nation making their move. But your thoughts on this opening scene?
Yeah, no, I think it is something to sort of understand sort of the context of the war in regards to this sort of show, because without understanding that, it kind of feels like it would have needed a different way of them sort of telling the story. So I thought this was pretty cool and neat sort of sequence of events to sort of give us this sort of, I guess, beginning idea of this world and sort of what's happening. I mean, you get to see sort of the fire bending, get to see the earth bending, and sort of how that's sort of going to be put on display here, as well as, understanding that there's more stuff going on here and that, things are sort of moving to effect here. So I thought it was definitely, it's definitely a cool, just a general sort of like, set piece to get people interested in, right? Like this is the first thing that people are going to see when they jump into this show. And, I'm sure not everyone who's watching this is going to have sort of the backing that we have as far as, our sort of knowledge on the show and stuff. So I think in terms of getting people interested in what's going on and sort of, the action and the events. I think this is, probably one of the better, set pieces you could set up to sort of start things going. And, it's pretty sort of brutal and sort of what happens here. So I think, that sort of fits the molds of things.
So this is also our first view of bending, and it's our first real time seeing a fight. And I've definitely seen some like back and forth on like, just how good, how well presented is the bending in this show. And I think people agree this Earthbender guy is probably one of the better kind of combatants that we see in Netflix Avatar. The style in general for the live action, I think, it's much more fluid than the M. Night Shyamalan movie, but it's maybe just a slight bit maybe slower than I think it needs to be to fully be as representative as I think it needs to be of bending. I think a lot of them, like you can tell, they really tried hard to make this come across as fluid as it needs to be. This scene in particular, I don't think is like a bad case at all. But just consistently as we kind of go through, it's maybe just a tiny bit slower than I feel it needs to be. But in general, I like a lot of the bending in the show. But your thoughts on the bending?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I'm curious to see how it turns out later on. But from this sort of initial sequence, I thought this was fine. I mean, I was able to sort of read his moves. I mean, yeah, there's differences compared to sort of the cartoon, and I'm trying to like not dive too deep in sort of my comparison mind of everything that happened one to one in the show. Even though obviously it's kind of hard to separate that. But no, I mean, I think, from this sort of sequence of events, the fire bending and the earth bending, the sort of back and forth sort of ploy that they have here, I think that, for me personally, it worked pretty well. I think, it didn't feel like it was, too sort of slow. I mean, I think, they do have sort of like the slow-mo moves, which is just like a current staple in like sort of our media and in general nowadays. So I don't think there's, much you can get away from it, but I don't think it was like too overdone that it sort of like annoyed me where it has in sort of some other shows and movies. We'll see if that holds to be true as the series goes further, for me at least. But I think it got across sort of the impact and everything that I think it was trying to sort of show, and even for sort of the fire bending as well, I think you could sort of understand sort of the concussion blows that it was actually, coming through when they were, sort of hitting the earthbending character here. But yeah, it definitely feels like, in terms of characters or just, his sort of ability, it definitely seems like, which you sort of would expect from like sort of a spy character, right? Like that they would be, generally pretty good at their sort of bending versus, compared to sort of troops, and considering how many people it takes to sort of take him down, that seems right to me. Like that seems in terms of like, power scaling and everything like that feels on par, and especially when, you compare to what you see later on with other people. So it worked for me.
So what happens to the spy? He's brought before Fire Lord Sozin, who is surprisingly not concerned about this message getting out and his plans being leaked, because he's happy that this will draw the attention of the Earth Kingdom. The Earth King will ready his forces. He'll get allies from the other nations, because everyone is expecting an attack on the Earth Kingdom. But that will actually distract from the real target. But just before we get the sort of reveal of his real target, he does just take care of this earthbender spy. So he just grabs his arm and basically just sets him on fire. They do this a few times in the show, just firebenders doing this to characters, and it's really clear here that like Sozin's extremely powerful, because he just immediately ignites this guy, and so he dies. And then immediately the discussion comes up between Sozin and like his minister and his general, like, are you sure air nomads are the right target? I don't feel they're a threat. But he says, no. The reason we're targeting them is because the new avatar is somewhere in the air nomads' midst. So we are going to wipe out all of the air nomads. And that is the end of the kind of opening sequence here of some clever strategy from Sozin. He brutally kills this spy, and then the air nomads are the target because he wants to kill the Avatar. So, very clear cut scene, nice portrayal of ultimately like one of the biggest bads in the entire franchise. So pretty happy with this scene overall. But your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think this definitely gets across sort of the sort of intimidation and sort of, the tactics that the Fire Nation at this point in time are sort of willing to do in order to accomplish their goals. And, that is their time in order to, sort of control the world or to set it across the sort of path that they have sort of envisioned. So yeah, I think, Sozin definitely comes across as a real sort of threat here. I mean, regardless of his, bending ability of being able to set this guy sort of aflame, sort of like almost sort of instantly here. I think it definitely, just sort of shows the whole sort of intimidation factor and everything, and just sort of, just sort of seeing, I guess, sort of the throne room in this era at this point in time. I think it gives you sort of a good sort of idea, and it's something that, the original one, it took us like forever to get to see sort of like the sort of big bad, but here we get it right up front, even if this is sort of, from back in the past, right? So it's definitely a different way of going about it, but I think it sort of fits what they're sort of, trying to do with this whole sort of backstory. And I think it definitely gives you a good bit of context to what's happening. So I think this scene is definitely feels like it's worth it to have it here.
hmm Then we get our kind of intro sequence here. So they give us our kind of fire, earth, air, water kind of bit here. And it's interesting because it seems to just be random benders. They don't initially here in just the first bit of this use known benders from what I can see. Visually, it's also a little bit kind of odd because it's kind of like I can barely tell like it's some sort of a blend of like live action maybe as the foundation, but it's like there's some sort of like almost visual filter over it. It's cool, but I'm almost every time I watch it, I'm kind of like, what's going on? Kind of quite here. Before we get into the Kyoshi bit, I suppose, what were your thoughts just on how they did this kind of intro from a visual point of view?
Yeah, no, I definitely had the same sort of feeling. So as soon as you started describing it, I was like, yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, it definitely has, I don't know, it has a unique feel to it, and I'm not, quite sure, because like you can tell that it has, it has some basis in sort of reality, but it definitely has sort of different sort of motion, almost a different sort of frame rate or flow that they have on top of it that sort of sets it apart. And I'm sure it's probably one of those things that they probably did entirely on purpose to sort of make it stand out and make it unique. And I think, depending on your preference, it could either work or not work for it. And I think for us, it probably doesn't quite work as well as it might sort of, have its original sort of intentions to it. But it definitely, it definitely stands out. It definitely has this sort of, own feel to it. So I think if that's what they're sort of going for, it definitely has that. But it definitely has a quality to the motion of some of the sort of benders that I don't know, it definitely feels odd to me, at least personally. I think some of the benders work better for me than others. And I think that's just, something that they just sort of chose to do in that sort of part. But it's definitely stands out.
Hmm. And we then find out that okay, this is Kyoshi narrating this. She's the one saying these lines here. And so as we go into the elements and go on to explain what the avatar is, it's Kyoshi who we see on screen demonstrating, an avatar using all four elements. And we do get some cool stuff. They still are doing this kind of like almost filtered kind of style here. But there is a really nice shot when they explain the idea of like the reincarnation of the avatar, this kind of endless staircase as like the way to showcase the idea of these are the past avatars going back in time. And I like that like Kyoshi kind of takes her place and then you see Roku kind of come onto screen. Really kind of clever shot at the end, but definitely some like weird visual style kind of throughout this as one of our first kind of showcases of some of this stuff. But interesting overall. But your thoughts on the Kyoshi little bit of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that part for me worked the best in terms of like fluidity and the movement and the explanations and the narration. So I think that part worked perfectly fine for me, and getting to see all the sort of past avatars, the ones that they at least, keep in frame there. I think, for the live action version of this and trying to make it sort of a bit sort of more, I don't know, I guess you could say grounded. I'll probably say that too much during this, but I think that has its place in here in terms of, making it feel like it's a real thing, a real sort of connection to sort of the past here. So I think that part worked well for me.
Hmm. And yeah, right before we kind of properly start, like Kyoshi kind of introduces Aang as this new avatar who will struggle with the responsibility of the role. So they get straight into like the character arc of Aang, and then we immediately cut into sort of the opening sequence here. So we're at the Southern Air Temple. We meet Aang. He's on top of the kind of temple here. He shows off his skills by doing this kind of airbending, jumping sequence down from the top of the temple, kind of showing off a little bit. He obviously, when he arrives down, he meets Gyatso, and they discuss the idea that, hey, you skipped your training. And we bring up the idea of, like, obviously Aang is a prodigy here. He's already a master, but Gyatso is stressing that he still has more to learn. And they make the point here with this line, which maybe is a little bit too on the nose given what happens, like that he may one day
Mm.
wish he spent more time with like his masters, basically. And we get to the core of this, which is that they are preparing to receive all of the air nomads from the other temples, because they are celebrating the Great Comet Festival. As we see a giant herd of sky bisons arrive at the Southern Air Temple from the other air temples. Really cool scene. It's like a full like migration of sky bisons here as they arrive here. So pretty cool opening sequence. I've seen it discussed obviously on social media that like, ooh, is it like Aang's airbending sequence here? Is it a little bit too flying esque? For me, it's just maybe like compared to what they do with Aang in the other episodes, it's maybe just a little bit too floaty here. But I think it's mostly fine. Otherwise, like I like the characterization here for Aang and Gyatso. They get into some of the immediate kind of ideas of he is this kind of prodigy, and we'll address that over the course of these episodes. Like I said, the one line's a little bit on the nose of just like, oh, I wonder what's about to happen next. But cool setup in that like the Great Comet Festival thing is here to explain the question I think many of us have had about the logistics of the attack to wipe out the air nomads. How did you actually do that? And this is a way to actually have all of the airbenders in one temple so that you can very easily understand why this one attack leaves a situation where we have a last airbender. But what are your thoughts on this opening sequence here?
Yeah, I think for the most part, this opening sequence works well for me. I think, along with you, the characterizations that we get of, Gyatso and Aang here, I think those definitely feel sort of like on point for, what we sort of have in most of our minds for these characters and how they sort of would interact with each other. I think, there's definitely, an understanding between the two of them. And Aang definitely seems, at least at this time, like, a fun, 12-year-old kid, as you would expect, who also has, abilities that make him sort of stand out among the rest of his fellow sort of, air nomads and, especially those of his, immediate or sort of his sort of age range, right? I think they make a point there to sort of, all look and see when he's sort of, jumping down, and his sort of ability to do that, sans any sort of type of, glider or, any sort of assistance on the way down. I definitely can, understand people's opinions on that. It definitely feels like he's like almost like nigh close to sort of flying, or he has a very very generous sort of fall down rate there. So I definitely can understand that sort of idea, and I think even in some other parts we'll get to, it also seems like he has sort of a exceptional sort of grasp on able to sort of stay in the air for extended period of times. At least, when we're comparing it to, say, sort of the original, animated series, which, if we didn't see that, would we necessarily think that as much? I don't know. But I mean, I think, the whole point that they're clearly trying to get across is just that he's he's very, very good at being an airbender, right? Like
Yeah.
that's his thing. He's a prodigy. He's above the rest. He has talents, as they'll say in like 2 seconds here. So I get from that point why they're sort of trying to say that. I wonder if they could have done it a different way, like maybe just had him use like the air scooter
Mm.
to like go all the way down or something like that, and that would have been just as cool and would have been a little bit more sort of grounded in terms of what we sort of have in our minds for this. But other than that, I think it works fine. You know, Aang seems cool.
Uh, Next scene, we get a little bit of kind of Gyatso and the elders focus here, where one of the other elders asks Gyatso if he has told Aang yet. And a concerned Gyatso says that it wasn't the right time, and you can tell Gyatso doesn't really know how to approach tackling this because I think he knows that it's going to not be met well by Aang. It's clear that the Southern Elders here, the leaders of the Southern Air Temple, know something is coming, and they feel that Aang kind of needs to be prepared for this before it's like too late. And we do cut then straight away to the kind of Elder Council here, so we get to see a lot of the high ups from the Airbenders, and especially because they're all here because of the comet, it's quite a big meeting here. So Gyatso basically argues for Aang to have more of a normal childhood. He is only 12. They argue that because he is the Avatar, they kind of need to prepare him now because of current affairs, basically. Gyatso is more worried about, obviously, Aang as a person, whereas a lot of the others are more arguing from the perspective of, like, he is the Avatar, and that means responsibility, therefore we have to kind of treat him a bit differently. And this is where they bring up that they feel Gyatso is too close to Aang, and they just agree without his agreement that, of course, Aang needs to be sent away to learn the other elements as soon as possible. So this is some of Aang's like storm flashback. We're just kind of seeing it kind of in line with the kind of rest of this kind of opening sequence. So it's definitely so far so good. Nothing particularly wrong at all. This is Gyatso characterized well. The other elders characterized pretty well. So yeah, pretty good so far. But your thoughts on the meeting of elders here and Gyatso?
Yeah, no, I like this sequence. I think this felt pretty well placed in terms of getting their sort of opinions. If it almost feels like they understood sort of Gyatso's perspective more in this than they did in sort of the original series. So I like that sort of, understanding that they seem to have here, but the end conclusion is still the same, that they need to tell sort of Aang this. So I don't know, it feels like they're taking overall throughout this, for at least for what I've seen so far, it feels like they're taking a more level-headed sort of approach to trying to sort of get these sort of topics out there for our characters to sort of talk and discuss them. Not that, there still isn't some sort of, rebelling against sort of the idea of what they have to do here, but it seems like they're at least, not going maybe sort of as heavy-handed as it has been done.
Mm-hmm. The only thing with this is I maybe wish they had explained a little bit more about like why the Airbenders think something is coming. Because they did this in the original, but because they never went into it at all, there's always this sort of like, I guess everyone just got a sense something was happening, whereas they've actually kind of explained it in part here. But what have the Airbenders been sort of like sensing here? And this is where like, in a way, some of that kind of RPG information comes into play with the original, where in the Roku era, which has obviously ended somewhat recently, there was quite a heavy kind of air nomad, in a way, attachment to the Fire Nation and influence happening there that obviously I guess the implication is that that's shut down in the meantime, and there's just some sense that stuff is happening there. I get why they maybe didn't want to go full on politics between the nations. What is everyone's opinion on everyone else? But I do feel Gyatso just says a few things here that's like, wait, how do we know the Fire Nation's heading down a dark path? Like, it's just like, if you're explaining it, can we explain a little bit more? But it's relatively fine overall. But then we get another interesting scene. We go to what I suppose we retroactively get told. This is Avatar Yang Chen's shrine. here at the Southern Air Temple. And this is where Aang got his tattoos. And Gyatso has chosen this to be the place where he actually reveals everything to Aang. So he talks to Aang about the Avatar. This is where they more sort of concretely talk about the idea of like, oh, Yang Chen was the previous air avatar. The cycle has now come back around to our nation. One of us basically is the avatar, and he reveals that it is Aang. You know, he's always been special, and there's a reason for that. Like, you are the avatar. This is where he notes that yes, the Fire Nation is on a dark path, and Aang will be needed. This is why you have to start your training immediately. And Aang immediately does start to panic. You can see the idea of like a lot of responsibility suddenly being placed on him, complete change of like his life basically as he knows it. Gyatso tries to give him confidence, but you can tell that like Aang is really, really panicking in his head, saying that like he doesn't want this power, doesn't want the responsibility. And we get to this kind of interesting point that like, you know, he says like the idea of like, you know, oh, you can stop pretending that like I'm your friend. But Gyatso's like, no, I am your friend. I'll always be your friend. As this kind of sequence comes to an end. So definitely in terms of getting across the kind of emotional kind of core of Aang's arc, the reluctant avatar, they do this really well. In these kind of initial stages, you can tell, you know, obviously Gyatso doesn't want to really reveal this early, because I suppose slightly going back to some context from the previous scene, they do kind of talk about the idea of like telling Aang too early will kind of affect him as a person if we don't do this right. But obviously stuff is happening and it has to happen here. So I think it's a well acted scene from both, and I think scenes like this highlight that, you know, they chose the right actors, I think, in pretty much every single character, and Gordon, I think, kind of stands out in some of these emotional scenes at the start here. But what are your thoughts on this scene in the Avatar Shrine?
Yeah, I think you definitely get across sort of the emotions that both of the characters have here in terms of, you know, what they're feeling, this sort of added responsibility that sort of isn't wanted by Aang and isn't wanted to be given by Gyatso, right? But, you know, you can see sort of the mental processes here of, you know, this sort of increase here and sort of the initial sort of, you know, reluctance of wanting to understand this and, you know, why me, you know, why am I sort of given this? I think that, you know, sort of back and forth here definitely comes across here, and, you know, Aang is definitely, you know, is definitely feeling, you know, sort of the added sort of effect here, and, you know, it's almost brought to, you know, sort of tears at this moment here, and this is just sort of, you know, the initial sort of stage here, right? So it's definitely just the beginning of everything that Aang is having to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Then we cut to sort of Aang on his own at kind of nighttime, and he doesn't know what to think. Appa flies over, and Aang basically vents to his friend, the Sky Bison here. He gets pretty emotional here. He does actually start to cry. He talks about how, yeah, he doesn't want the responsibility or this power. He fears kind of the loneliness that might come from this, and how this will like separate him from everyone he knows, because he is being sent away before he was kind of meant to be, basically. But then he decides to get on Appa to basically fly up high, basically to kind of clear his head. And this is probably where we get what I think is the most kind of universally criticized change with this opening episode, and that is that this is Aang running away, but it's obviously not him running away. It's a weird one where, as we'll go through these episodes, they have characters really go nuclear on Aang for responsibility, like, you know, you need to pick up this duty. But then, for some reason, even though they're stronger on that side of things, they undercut like Aang's actual kind of being at fault here by having him running away being like this coincidence with the timing. That just feels a little bit weird. I don't think it ruins everything, but it's one of the, I think, bigger changes that feels like, why did you do this? Are you like kind of, were you afraid to give the character a just clear-cut flaw in all of this, when this, with Aang and what they've been doing, the responsibility arc is clear here. This Aang, with how much they're hitting this, should run away given what's kind of happening. So it's such a weird decision that they're so strict on it, but then do it in this way. Because watching it the first time, it's so like not the runaway scene that you almost are surprised when you go back to it and realize that actually this is the runaway scene. But what are your thoughts on this and what this means, I suppose, given that it's important?
Yeah, no, that's something to consider for sure. I mean, I think, I've seen this, I guess, two times or so at this point, and I don't know, it definitely, I mean, once you connect it with what happens later on, and him getting stuck, of course, I don't know, it seems clear to me that this is sort of the runaway, not runaway scene, as I guess you're sort of saying here. Yeah, it definitely does seem like they do definitely emphasize sort of his, I guess, just the idea of responsibility in general. Like that's said many times in just these first two episodes, so I can only imagine how much is said, throughout the course of the whole sort of series here. But I don't know. I mean, I think for me initially, at least in the context of only seeing this so far, it didn't bother me too much that this wasn't his like he was going to sort of like clear his mind, because it feels like throughout this they're trying to make it seem like they're like he has reluctance in everything that he's doing, but he's not so immature or so sort of rebellious as a 12-year-old that he's going to sprint away from all his troubles. Like he still has, it feels like he still has enough connection, and that they didn't, compared to sort of like the cartoon, they didn't like try to directly rip him away from Gyatso, that he feels like he has to go on his own. Like it felt like they held back in that regard, which maybe that wasn't the play to be. Maybe they should have gone, full on, we're going to force him away, and Gyatso, isn't even going to get a chance to say anything to him. But because they didn't do that, it didn't bother me, at least initially, that he wasn't actually sort of trying to run away. He was just sort of trying to go up and sort of clear his mind, as he sort of said here. But I definitely can understand how this sort of change in it can be sort of like, why did they do that? Why didn't they just go the other way? I don't know. Maybe they just didn't want to make it seem, or make the elders seem as sort of as mean as they did come across in the original sort of series here. I don't know. Maybe this is one of those cases where they try to tote the line, and they should have just gone all one way or the other way and just sort of let things sort of play out. But no, other than that sort of part, his, internal dialogue, struggle, discussion here, that part, itself didn't really bother me too much. Him sort of just trying to figure things out.
Yeah, like everything else is there. It's just like the writing chooses this when I think there's, I wouldn't say universal, but I think there's been quite a lot of like, yeah, this is pretty clear cut. I think you should have just done the other one. But this is where we get the big thing where we cut, Aang kind of runs off, and then we immediately just kind of basically pan down, and basically climbing up the mountain is Sozin and his men arriving at the Southern Air Temple. So the comet allows them all to do the sort of fire flying jet technique to get up onto the high temple. There's no dragons here, for anyone wondering. The first airbender spots this, realizes it's an attack. He tries to sound the alarm and get everyone going. Fights back as best he can, of course, because the air nomads are good at dodging. He's able to dodge for quite a while, but he does eventually get hit, and eventually gets kind of sent through a wall, and the idea is that like he goes down here at this point. So we're in the action sequence here, so I'll get through some of this. So Gyatso goes to basically gather the children to protect them. This is where he realizes that, oh, I can't find Aang anywhere. As we cut back to the kind of courtyard, we see that the battle is full on raging at this point. It's basically kind of armies clashing here with how many people are on screen. The air nomads are obviously fighting really well here because there's so many masters at the temple, versus the implication, I think, is that there's not as many masters, perhaps full-on masters, in the Fire Nation ranks. They're just comet empowered, which makes them difficult to deal with. So we get this situation where the story here is the masters kind of guarding the retreat of the kids. So we see, I think this character gets named. This is Sister Liu. She guards the bridge as Gyatso crosses over with the kids into Yang Chen's shrine. and we see the towers fall as the big attacks come in, and so you're really getting the sense that this is like the fall of the air nomads, and this is where we cut to Aang struggling in the storm for the first time. So, your thoughts on this opening part of the attack on the Southern Air Temple here?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, it definitely gets across sort of the scale of what's sort of happening here and how it, it really felt like it was sort of like out of nowhere. And it definitely feels like, this is full on battle, full on, fight for your life sort of event here that definitely didn't seem to have any sort of, indication that it was happening at all here. And definitely feels like there's definitely, definitely feels like, bearing, any sort of like enhancements overall that, the airbenders probably would have had this pretty well. And I think, the way to go about showing sort of the battle and everything, I think this part feels sort of the most, as grounded as you can say, airbending would be in sort of reality. This definitely feels like this works well in terms of, sort of the combat sort of effectiveness of both sort of sides here and seeing how they play out against each other. So I think, no, at least for this initial scene here and how it goes about, it feels like it works for me.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. This is definitely great because you see the kind of definitely that contrast, like just how skilled so many of these master benders are, and that the comet is kind of the turning point here for in so many cases. And like just seeing like the story being told here, seeing some of these characters that we do see in the animation at specific points, the focus on kind of protecting the kids. But yes, we will continue here. So yeah, Sozin makes his kind of move at this point. So he goes up to Sister Liu, who's been doing this kind of crazy airbending tornado to guard the bridge. But he basically just lights the tornado on fire. It turns into a fire tornado, and she goes down. He then crosses the bridge into the shrine with his soldiers, and so we get Gyatso has a little bit of a fight sequence against the soldiers, and he takes them out. But then we get the big Sozin Gyatso confrontation. So Gyatso defends against Sozin here. He's trying to defend the kids, of course. Sozin then has a bit of dialogue, interestingly, kind of saying that basically, like, on any other night you might have won, but not this night, not with the comet. And he just like pushes his firebending to its limit and just completely overwhelms Gyatso's defenses. And so Gyatso falls, and at basically the same time as this happens, this is like the exact moment where, like, out at sea, Appa and Aang go down in the storm. Aang activates the Avatar State defense mechanism and goes into the ball of air and ice, basically. And so that is how the giant flashback sequence here ends. Definitely some interesting stuff. Love the kind of air tornado, the fire tornado. That was pretty brutal. I wish Gyatso had maybe had a little bit of a better showing overall, but I maybe get the idea they want to emphasize how kind of kind he is, that he kind of represents the best of the air nomads, so he focuses entirely on like defense to a certain degree. But I just perhaps would have liked to have seen maybe get something in on Sozin, just to highlight that even though Sozin's going to beat him here, it's like it's for sure the case that like any other night, yeah, Gyatso would have won. But I get it, to really get across the impact of the comet, this was perhaps the right decision, so I'm not too massively concerned about that. Gyatso's skill probably is something that we maybe should see in like other content somewhere, rather than this giant battle here. But definitely a scene that like accomplishes everything it needs to do. The Sozin and just how brutal he is. Like, there's even a point where like he just walks past an air nomad that's sort of like still moving on the ground and just like incinerates him on the ground, just getting across that he does not care. So that characterization was strong. But your thoughts on the end of the backstory?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely gets across that this whole sort of endeavor here is like, the most brutalist, thing ever that they could sort of decide to do. And yeah, Sozin here, I mean, his I mean, I don't know. It feels like he probably would have been like pretty powerful regardless of having the comet, but he's definitely, I think they're trying to show that he is on another level here, just sort of, the one-to-one comparison here for that end battle. Because otherwise, yeah, like you said, it might have been, more sort of evenly-ish sort of mashed here, depending on sort of, the context and if, Gyatso would have struck first. But I mean, he was able to take down the sort of initial sort of firebenders and even all the other ones. He was able to hold them sort of at bay here. So definitely is sort of a sad sequence of events here, but it definitely just shows how much they were just sort of ready to attempt to sort of throw at this sort of idea that Sozin had, and how he wanted to find the Avatar at all sort of costs here. So definitely gets that across very well.
So yeah, that is the ending of the flashback. So I suppose it is interesting given that it was quite broad in scope, that like they don't do anything else. Like they don't do any sort of attempt to go through like Sozin, then into Azulon, transition into Ozai or anything like that. They don't overdo it in terms of like bringing some of, say, like the Avatar and the Fire Lord kind of stuff into play here. It's just straight up Gyatso falls. It's kind of like the significance of this to Aang is kind of the focus, which I thought was quite interesting. It leaves them stuff to work with down the line, certainly. But this is where we finally get into sort of present day stuff, and into kind of more of just the kind of straight adaptation stuff that they need to do. So we open up here, and interestingly, it's Katara trying to waterbend, and she's doing her practice here in basically the remains of this Fire Nation ship. It's kind of like iced over in the middle, and there's like a pool of water that she's trying to create like the water ball out of, but she can't quite get it. She kind of forms a bit of a sphere, but she can't get it out of the water, basically. So then she heads back to the village. This is where we meet Sokka, who's kind of organizing the kids for guard duty and stuff like that. Then he and Katara head out fishing because the last fishing trip came back with no fish. And we see that when they're out on the water, Sokka is extremely cautious about Katara waterbending, because basically of the history of the tribe and them being hunted for being waterbenders. And we'll get the details with Katara and Aang later about some of that as well. He also says she should focus more on helping out in the village. She argues that preparing to fight is not the only thing that anyone should focus on, that waterbending is just as important to their tribe. Katara mentions like Hakoda here, but Sokka says that like he's not here, I am, and this is kind of part of how they do the Katara Sokka dynamic over the course of the season. It's because they don't do certain elements of both characters, they lean more into this kind of dynamic where Sokka feels such a responsibility that he is kind of almost deciding what Katara can do and maybe not letting her kind of do as much as she needs to do. It's an interesting one, and obviously it's something they chose to do instead of certain other kind of smaller elements that aren't quite here. But what are your thoughts on this opening sequence here, getting to meet Katara and Sokka in this version?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, it feels, like they're sort of core sort of characters here. It feels like, they're related. They have this sort of, understanding with each other, while, one is definitely sort of overprotective, for, reasons that, are sort of understandable, but, is sort of, doesn't quite sort of understand sort of the full mark or the full scope of the village, which is, something that obviously Sokka's going to have to learn over time here, right? So that's, it definitely, I don't know, it definitely does have a dynamic that's different than, I guess, if you're trying to compare it to the other one, but it doesn't, I don't know, I think, in trying to think of it in terms of just this sort of show here, it doesn't bother me too much, especially where, at least by the next episode, they try to lead it as far as it's being more of like the two of them have this sort of responsibility, even though, Sokka still, is trying to sort of, for the most part, still trying to sort of take the lead on things, but, it feels like he is at least slightly aware enough to realize, some things after, they're sort of brought to the surface or brought to his, forethought.
Hmm. And I suppose slightly alluding to stuff from later episodes, but like it is interesting because the stuff they do with Hakoda is weird, but I'll just kind of leave it at that. Just thinking about the whole magnitude of this arc, but we go on. So this is where we more get the opening sequence here, where like they get caught in a current. There's a bit of ice dodging that kind of goes on here. They eventually crash into the kind of like ice embankment here, which is like attached onto Aang's ice sphere, basically. So this is where we get the situation that the canoe ends up floating away, as Katara, of course, notices that what's this like perfectly spherical construct of ice that we're looking at right here. And we did then immediately cut to Zuko for the first time. So we see Zuko's ship also in southern waters. We see him writing in his notebook, noting all sorts of information about past avatars. He has researches everywhere, conspiracy theories about avatars all over the place here. And then we cut back to Katara. So what are your thoughts on these two quick scenes here?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is cool. I mean, this, it's different, but I think it's, it fits the mode of, what we sort of expect this sort of, I guess sort of initial sort of engagement of, curiosity of what's sort of happening here. This is just sort of the random sort of circumstances that occur to sort of get things moving into place. And, it's interesting to see, Zuko at the same sort of time here, and especially how he feels, I guess a little bit different of this than what we sort of have thought of him sort of before. So to see him sort of taking these meticulous, notes and stuff, it definitely leads you to other places than you might have thought of before.
Hmm. So then we get Katara attempting to pull the canoe back with water bending, and I'm not entirely clear on this, but what I have written down here in my summary is that the strain of her trying to bring the boat back starts to crack the ice behind her, which is what shatters the sphere. The beam shoots into the sky. We cut to Zuko. We see his Avatar Funko Pops, his statues, lighting up in the distance. And then Aang kind of comes out glowing, collapses to the ground, and we get a little bit of a back and forth with Katara and Sokka. Skeptical Sokka is like, could be an enemy, and then Katara's just like it's a kid like us. Do you really think that's what this is? And so yeah, they're going to save Aang. And as we cut away from the scene, we do get a little bit of a tease of like Appa is still in the ice. They haven't noticed him because they didn't like check inside of it, of course. So they've swapped a few little bits and pieces around here, but it mostly achieves everything that it absolutely needs to do. Zuko seeing his statues glow. He goes outside, he sees the big glow, and you can see the hope light up in his eyes that finally his search is over.
Mhm.
My only criticism here is that I didn't find it like super clear that it was Katara who cracked the ice. Like this was like, I think, incredibly obvious in the original, but they didn't do that, of course, because Katara gets angry at Sokka's sexism, and that little character point isn't really here in this version. I just feel in terms of execution, if that's the intent of the scene, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of that. And this maybe gets into the presentation of Katara a little bit, is that we don't see Katara as like highly strung at certain points. Like we don't see as many big outbursts of emotion from this version of Katara. She's a little bit more kind of soft, kind of spoken in scenes. So that's just an interesting kind of way to do things. But like I said, it mostly achieves everything I think it needs to do here. But your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely get the sort of idea of that it's not exactly 100% clear as what's sort of happening. And I don't know, I think my initial thought of it, since it's not, sort of as her being sort of angry over Sokka of what he sort of said that made her sort of like super bend without really knowing how to bend, that it was more of her sort of struggle of not being able to connect with her chi that sort of was the sort of catalyst for, sort of connecting with Aang's spirit, or just sort of the bending in general that allowed it sort of to, know him more or less sort of crack the ice itself, less than her sort of directly, sort of cracking the ice like it was in sort of the original series. That was my sort of initial sort of thought on this, since it's not,
Mhm.
as clear that she's like, slamming down on the ground and the ice is chipping off because of her. That was my sort of thought of it, but that's only sort of with the understanding of what happens later on with the when Aang's sort of explaining sort of how she can sort of waterbend a little bit sort of better. Um, but otherwise, yeah, it definitely feels like it's definitely not as clear as it is in the animation if they were trying to say that she's directly sort of cracking the ice. So if that's what they were going for, I definitely don't see it from that sort of perspective there. But regardless, the sort of, it's sort of breaking, sort of seeing Aang sort of in sort of the initial sort of connection with the Avatar spirit to sort of release him. And I don't know, I thought it was cool that it's sort of, connected with sort of what Zuko sort of had in his room, and
Mm.
that sort of was what sort of brought him out. And he's, I don't know, it feels like this Zuko definitely has more of an idea of sort of the history of the Avatar, and sort of, what sort of things around it, even if his, signs have been sort of false in the past, at least as far as what Iroh's been saying. Um, there's definitely something to say that he actually sort of see this here, which makes me sort of wonder why later on Iroh sort of doubts this one so much, considering it seems like other people sort of saw this as well on the deck of the ship. But otherwise, it works fine for me.
hmm we get a relatively quick scene back in the village. We get Gran Kana realizing that Aang is an airbender, and they pretty much just leave him to rest at this point. Then we immediately cut to Zuko talking to his uncle. Zuko's completely convinced the Avatar is back. He's searched 3 years for the Avatar. He's been banished, and finally, it's finally happening for him. He's ready to capture the Avatar, present it to the Fire Lord, and effectively get his life back. Is kind of the way they go for it. Iroh, of course, doesn't want Zuko to get his hopes up, but he also doesn't want to like dash Zuko's hopes by like in a way revealing the truth that I think he understands about like his brother, that Zuko has so much hope. This is what's driving him. If he says that this is a complete fool's errand, he's worried he's going to like kind of destroy Zuko here. So it's interesting. You can see the subtlety. This is here in both this and the original version of just Iroh trying to find the right line of like supportive and kind of realistic on this topic. But yeah, it's a pretty well done scene here overall. But your thoughts on this one?
I agree with that. I think even later on we see more of that, of Iroh sort of definitely trying to hint at sort of the larger scale of things that's sort of happening. How like, even though, maybe it didn't work for Iroh, but he has enough sort of understanding and wisdom, which, I feel like Zuko does sort of take a lot of that into account, as he did in sort of the original one as well here. But it definitely feels like he understands the broader scope of things. But like you said, he's definitely, he's trying to be, sort of the classic Iroh that we know, while trying to be sort of supportive of things and stuff like that. So definitely feels, sort of on point in terms of, their characterization so far.
hmm Next, Aang wakes up. He goes outside. He sees the kids playing and immediately kind of goes to play with them. Sokka immediately sees this and is like, "No, enemy, skeptical of you." Aang then introduces himself. Sokka continues, of course, to be quite cautious. Then we get a pretty fun scene where Aang's just like, "Hey, Appa, I'm looking for Appa." But as Katara and everyone else arrives, Sokka's just like, "Yeah, he's over there," and Aang's just doing crazy airbending stuff off in the distance. He uses his bison whistle at this point, and then we do get the arrival of Appa at the Southern Water Tribe, Wolf Cove, of course. And this, of course, shocks the entire village because they've not seen an animal like this, of course. So, um, just a fun scene. I think they do a good job at having little scenes like this. We see one of these in the next episode as well. Aang, of course, having fun playing, and they emphasize his like connection with people. So that's pretty nice here. But yeah, fun, and especially the whole Sky Bison scene where he just repeats it over and over again, like Sokka doesn't understand words. But your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, I think this is definitely one of the fun scenes that sort of connects with sort of the fun playfulness that Aang, is definitely sort of known for having here. Yeah, I mean, I think it's telling that he's able to sort of, understand the fun that they're having. As considering, I mean, he is sort of their sort of same age, right? Like he's not so far gone or anything like that that he wouldn't sort of want to be in that sort of position here, even if, Sokka is, obviously very hesitant and thinks he's initially the enemy and everything like that here. But yeah, the whole thing with the Sky Bison definitely, plays out pretty well and, has a good sort of back and forth that you can see that these characters are going to have here.
Hmm. And I suppose while we're here, maybe we should talk about Appa. I think the design for Appa here in this, the CG on Appa is really, really good. As the series progresses, you can tell they have to be pretty selective about when they have scenes with Appa. But other than that, I think it's like a really fantastic looking CG model for Appa. But what are your thoughts on how he looks?
Yeah, for me, I think from what I've seen so far, he definitely works in terms of what we've sort of have seen from the animated show and sort of other various sort of forms of media here. I think they make it look realistic enough for what they're sort of doing here, the scale and everything like that, and sort of his sort of mannerisms and stuff like that. I think they got one of the more better studios that does like sort of the creature stuff as well, so you can see why it looks as good as it does here, especially considering sort of their budget and where they have to use it, and how they just can't throw Appa everywhere around as they did in sort of the original sort of series here. So for me, I think it works fine.
Mm.
He works cool.
Mm-hmm. And then we get a really interesting scene. They bring Aang back inside, and it's like, okay, Aang, explain some stuff here. So he does explain he went down in a storm. He explains he's from the Southern Air Temple. Everyone's a bit confused by this because like it hasn't happened yet. Everyone hasn't realized that there's a 100-year gap basically between these two kind of knowledge pools. And so he mentions that like, oh yeah, everyone was there because of the Great Comet Festival. And Gran's the one to react to this and be like, okay, I think I get what's happening here. And then she basically reads out Katara's intro from the cartoon version of Avatar: The Last Airbender, effectively like the legend of the war, and eventually kind of turns it around and is like, I see what's happening here. You don't know the history of the last like 100 years because you are from 100 years ago, because that's when the comet was last seen 100 years ago. So this is where she realizes that you're the last airbender. This is why no one has seen one. You're the only one that's left. And he runs out of the kind of tent, unable to accept that this is the kind of truth of his reality in this moment. So obviously they do this reveal differently than the original. This happens with like Aang and Katara in the ship. But I think this one actually works. This is a perfectly fine change in my mind. Like Gran with as the older character with more knowledge of the history. It's a perfectly fine way to do it. I know some people had a bit of an issue with Gran's acting performance, and maybe especially the reading out the intro, but I thought it was fine because they used that as like that is the written like legend of what happened 100 years ago type thing. So I didn't have that same complaint that other people had. So yeah, like this is an effective way to reveal information to get to a relatively similar point. But your thoughts?
Yeah. I think on my initial watch of this, or my initial sort of feeling of this, it felt, I don't know, I think it felt more exposition-y than it actually really is, because I'm thinking of it in terms of the show and the people in here, like, they don't know sort of the history, right? And Aang, the character here, he doesn't know sort of the history and understand sort of the context of what he's been away here, or where he's been away from, right? So in terms of that and having, Grand actually do this, that, it makes sense in that. And she's sort of, speaking sort of what's happened over the course of the years. And I think, the scene itself, it works pretty well. They definitely, shoot it in sort of a way that makes it sort of like off-putting for Aang, so that, he's like feeling sort of unease in the situation, that, eventually he sort of runs out from sort of the room and everything. So I think, in terms of that and seeing the reaction from the other people in the tribe here, and how they're all sort of, downcast on this sort of, retelling of this, because like, they say here, they all know the story already, but he doesn't know it. So I think, in terms of that, it definitely feels like it works for, a way of getting Aang up to speed on the current, status of the world here, even if he's still, not ready to fully sort of accept it.
Mm-hmm. There's a quick scene at this point, Zuko kind of preparing his troops. He tries to inspire them, but it's from like his point of view, and it's clear that at this point they're not on the kind of exact same page. So, he has this kind of like desperate want to capture the Avatar, and he kind of tries to inspire that in them, and they're not kind of quite there yet. And then there is Katara going out to talk to Aang. He's of course stunned, still trying to accept all this knowledge of that, like he's 100 year kind of like displaced from time. Everyone he knows is gone. She then talks about her own loss, the firebenders attacking the village, her father and the other warriors leaving as sort of another type of loss because the war is going on. Aang kind of connects with Katara here, noting that, you had to grow up fast, and she notes that, like, we all did. There are some slight flashbacks at this point to Kaya, basically like referencing like the Southern Raiders stuff at this point. The fire, as she mentions here, that yes, the Fire Nation has conquered most of the world. The Waterbenders and Earthbenders still fight back, but she does note that basically the world is out of balance because of the war. The nations mostly kind of stick to themselves because everyone's just so defensive in the war, and that's the situation that it kind of created here. So I think another like relatively like effective scene here, getting across the kind of idea. I have noticed some people say that like is the episode like super exposition heavy. Myself, I never tend to mind that too much, just because like there's a certain point at which you have to explain a certain amount of information to people. Like, maybe sometimes it can be like a little bit wordy, or they can just like assume you'll pick up on this along the way. But I tend to not overly mind when things are just explained, especially early on, when like the whole kind of universe you're trying to understand here. And I didn't find it to be like an incredible amount of information presented here, but that's this scene. But do you have any thoughts on this Katara and Aang talk?
Yeah, no, I think it's funny because for this scene here, I didn't feel any of the sort of over exposition that I felt even from a little bit, even though there's definitely more being talked about here compared to the sort of previous sort of scenes here. But no, I thought this was a good way for them to sort of, connect, relatively quickly over sort of the current events and things that have happened, and sort of, bringing understanding to Aang in terms of the current situation and how one might sort of deal with, the situation at hand. I mean, I think, this is part of Katara's sort of thing overall, even from the original one, is sort of, being sort of understanding and, sort of seeing from the other point of view of, the characters or the ones that her friends that she's interacting with here. So I think, they definitely do, I don't know, that feels like that was done pretty well here for me, at least.
Mm-hmm. Then there's a quick scene of Zuko practicing firebending on the ship. He does pretty good form. Iroh praises him for it, but Zuko sort of notes that like he has to be prepared to face basically the most powerful bender in the world here, the Avatar. That's what he's preparing for. The legends and what he knows about the Avatar, he has stuff in his head like, I'm effectively going to be facing like an Avatar Kyoshi equivalent here, and she took down an entire squadron of Earth Kingdom soldiers single-handedly, and Iroh's still kind of like, how much should I lean into like teaching him more or what? Iroh doesn't, I suppose, know what to make of what they're going to see just yet. But nice little kind of martial arts sequence here from Zuko. It's obviously there's a similar scene in the cartoon. It's not exactly the same, but again, it gets across the same basic ideas here. But any thoughts on Zuko practicing here and a Kyoshi reference?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely feels the same as sort of the other one. It gets across that he's training, he has, some skill. Like it looks, from this without understanding any other sort of context from like, his sister or any other sort of benders. It feels like he's reasonably skilled. Now, of course, he sort of has to bring himself sort of down here when talking about sort of Kyoshi and the Avatar and their sort of abilities here. And I don't know, to me, it felt like, Iroh's just like, yeah, I mean, you're good, but like even I'm not really quite going to be able to survive like a full-on Avatar if that really happens here. So, it's kind of like, what are you really sort of trying to get at here? But, in terms of, Zuko trying to show that he's driven towards his goal regardless of anything else, I think, that point comes across pretty clear.
Mm-hmm. Next, Katara shows Aang that she's a waterbender, but she notes that she has not made much progress since she's the only waterbender in the south. All of them were killed by firebenders, and she wants to do more, but what can she do with no one to train her? Aang then, effectively, just by talking about kind of bending, gives her like a little bit of just basic fundamentals for like any bender here, talking about finding balance, letting your energy flow, and also the idea of like letting go. This all helps her, and she's actually able to make the water ball come up out of the water and make that kind of first step forward. So this is a nice little scene to kind of get Katara up to a level where, okay, you can actually throw some water around at this point. Just the simple basics of any bending is enough to get someone to a certain point, especially if they have so much potential like Katara does. So yeah, and another pretty nice scene here. Overall, not too much to say here, but it's nice. That I like them referencing that. Yeah, Aang gives her the first little lesson here. But your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it's, she was just sort of, helping him in the last sort of scene here, and now it's sort of the other way around. So I think it's a good back and forth that they're already showing between the two sort of characters here, and how they're gonna work well potentially in the future.
Mm-hmm. Next, the Fire Nation arrives. The Southern Water Tribe kind of prepares for battle. Gran reveals at this point that she's basically had suspicions, but she pretty much knows it at this point. The only reason the Fire Nation would be coming in kind of like this heavily is that Aang probably has to be the Avatar. And this is where we get this moment here of like Sokka just like really snaps at Aang of just like, well, if you are the Avatar, like you abandoned the world, like how many people died because you're away? I think even calls him a coward here. So this is one of what ends up being a couple of characters who really like criticize Aang for kind of being away for as long as he was here. So a pretty kind of heavy scene there for Sokka to kind of say that. And again, it's relating back to the whole idea of Aang didn't actually like run away. In this version, it's kind of like a coincidence of timing that just happens to line up with the fact that Aang is struggling with his responsibilities as the Avatar. And it's, again, like, because you're hitting it harder, you should just have it be an actual flaw that Aang did run away. That's just my thoughts on it, to just make the arc as kind of clear and kind of clean as possible. Otherwise, like, I don't think Sokka should be maybe criticizing Aang as much here. Like I get it in the middle of like a war, like people saying these things when they don't quite mean it. These type of scenes happen, but it's just noticeable, I think, when you see this happen in the episode. But I like the kind of frantic action here, as like even the devastated Southern Water Tribe kind of prepares for battle here. But what are your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, I definitely can understand the sort of idea that, Sokka does seem, I guess, a little bit harsh, with us having the understanding of the context. Of course, he doesn't really have that sort of understanding, so, he's just sort of, only seeing the sort of end result of the past sort of 100 years, and that, obviously is not a good position that, they've been sort of put in here. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't bother me too much that he's getting into it because he doesn't sort of understand the whole thing. But yeah, in terms of the grander, sort of scheme of things, it definitely feels like that's making it a bit sort of harder to sort of, feel as mad at Aang. But I mean, he is sort of a younger kid and sort of, wouldn't necessarily understand the responsibilities in general here. So I don't know. It's definitely something to say, but it is something to see that they've, it feels like they're, as prepared as they can be in this sort of, small sort of village here in terms of being sort of attacked in this sort of context here. So it's something to be
Mm.
said.
Yeah, and I suppose there's also like a timing kind of situation as well, where like Aang only reveals himself as the Avatar in the original, kind of at the same moment as he effectively like saves the tribe. So the moment of kind of criticism happens at effectively the same time that they kind of need to thank him for saving them. So it kind of prevents maybe some of this stuff from actually happening because they have to just accept all of this stuff at the exact same time of like, he saved us, but he's the Avatar. What does this mean? Um, but anyway, we will move on. Zuko announces himself at the gate. He's looking for an outsider. Hand him over, or he'll burn the village down, basically. Sokka immediately does just want to hand Aang over to protect the tribe, to follow his father's kind of orders to be responsible. Katara argues back using what their mother said in the past, and that is that they need to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and that think about Aang. Like, he's lost everything. Like, we've lost certain people, but he's lost everything he knows. Like, think about that. And she notes how hard like Sokka's responsibility has been on him, like it has everyone. But there's more to think about here than just that. That Aang, as the Avatar, is hope for everyone, and hope is something that the village desperately needs. So I did like this. This is kind of one of these Katara speeches. I think in reflection, I maybe wish it was kind of just delivered with a little bit more kind of strong, kind of building kind of emotion, more cartoon Katara. Just because I think I do note reflecting on a lot of this stuff, like Katara's just a little bit subdued. Like, she's connecting with the like emotional stuff like she's meant to, but I would like to see a few more kind of strong emotional kind of moments from her. But it still gets across, I think, the main things that need to be got across here overall. So yeah, everyone's definitely mostly in character. But what are your thoughts on the meeting of leaders here, basically?
Yeah, yeah. This, I guess, I don't know. It's definitely not an angry, upset at the world sort of Katara here. It's definitely more of the compassion, sort of heartfelt sort of Katara here. But yeah, I think, it does get across. I think Sokka here, like he understands sort of like, the better way of doing things, even if it isn't necessarily his first sort of, choice and sort of idea of things. I think that's sort of what they've shown, even just in this episode, the sort of idea of Sokka and his sort of character and sort of like, he knows sort of the better thing to do, but he just, maybe he wants to take the easier out, or maybe he just wants to do sort of his initial sort of gut reaction sort of first here. But yeah, definitely, it's one of those sort of beginning of sort of seeing where, the characters will sort of end up eventually.
Mm-hmm. So Sokka makes his mind up at this point. He grabs his club. He's prepared to fight for Aang. So alone, he exits the village through the gate. He's going to confront Zuko. He's a bit awkward in his introduction, but he gets across his point. He's definitely brave here. Zuko is going to basically leave it to his men to just take Sokka out. But Sokka, I think, latches on pretty nicely to this and is just like, hey, let's do this like leader to leader. Let's settle it that way. And Zuko's men, like G, is like, we don't need to do this. Like, we can just overpower them, no problem. But Zuko actually like agrees, and I definitely interpret this as being a little bit of like, he realizes the kind of honor in this because it's effectively like an Agni Kai-esque thing that Sokka's asking for here, and he's kind of like, okay, I'll do that, fine. And so he accepts that kind of sort of respectfully. So their fight begins immediately. Sokka dodges, he's on the defensive. he's going good for a little second, but then he does quickly get kind of defeated. He's just not powerful enough to take on a skilled bender like Zuko. This is where Aang then steps in to defend Sokka, revealing himself to Zuko and everyone to be an airbender. And Zuko obviously connects a few dots in his head and basically makes the connection everyone else has, that, oh, it must be him. And you can tell in his head, he's like, but it's a kid, how does this work? But yes, Aang gives himself up to protect the village. He says basically it's okay to Katara, who's about to kind of jump in. And then a nice little addition here, like he just praised Sokka for his bravery, for fighting for him. Like no one's fought for me before. That's one of the bravest things I've ever seen, basically. So, again, another pretty nice scene overall here. I thought they got the balance right here of like Sokka having, a little bit of skill. Like you got the impression he maybe could have taken it like one, maybe two random firebenders, but Zuko was a step too far. But yeah, pretty good scene for Sokka here. But your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think Sokka definitely feels like overall, especially when you get into the next episode, he feels a bit, a little bit more sort of competent than he felt in the sort of the original sort of series here. At least that's what I got from here. It's definitely a different take on the character, which for me personally, so far at least, it doesn't really bother me at all. But he still has flaws. He's not perfect. All our characters still have to grow here. But yeah, it's definitely a good sort of setup scene here, and Aang coming in and sort of being pretty sort of powerful and having sort of the advantage here. And I think if he maybe had more of the sort of combative sort of spirit here, he probably could have won this encounter and sort of saved sort of the village. But it's definitely not sort of his sort of mindset here. So him giving himself up here sort of fits within the mode that we have going here. And I like that he did have that, like you mentioned, the little sort of goodbye, sort of saying to Sokka here. And I think that definitely, helps with Sokka's decision just coming up.
Sokka, this is an interesting scene because I feel they maybe should have given Katara a little bit more in this scene, because you can tell she's maybe about to be like, oh, it's that moment of I really need to convince Sokka, but Sokka's already made his mind up. But she doesn't really even get a chance to like make any sort of a case. It's just Sokka goes up to basically the next oldest boy in the tribe, is my take on this, and is basically like, you're in charge now, keep up the drills, and we were a bit sloppy, repair this thing, me and Katara are going to save Aang, basically. That sort of idea. This is more of a small little thing, but I felt they maybe just took a little bit of the Katara focus of like this scene from the original out of this. I get it, it's sort of like Sokka's kind of moment here, but it's like Katara had already made her mind up to go all in on Aang before this. And just because I feel Katara isn't getting as much attention here, I'm just kind of noticing little things like this. But what are your thoughts on this? Like a little bit of a change here, kind of highlighting that there is actually like another teenage boy in the village, which wasn't the case in the original.
Yeah. I mean, I think you noticed that from before, that their ages are a bit different with the characters here, and so that's sort of a different sort of setup. I think he's still younger than Sokka. I think that comes across pretty clear here. But I don't know. I think for me, considering how they've so far taken Sokka's character and not trying to sort of keep it as beholden to the original as it was, it didn't bother me too much that Sokka was sort of, the one to sort of decide here that, he was going to sort of help Aang. And of course, Katara's coming along because she already made up her mind, like you were saying there. So I don't know. I don't know. I kind of like that this version of Sokka was, already about to do the right sort of thing. I think they've skewed his characterization a little bit enough here that he has sort of the better intentions, at least as soon as he sort of gets the right idea in his head here. So I don't know, that part sort of worked for me, at least here. I think if they don't give, Katara any other sort of scenes, and, more of this than I do, but I think, if they start regulating Katara too much later on, then that'll feel sort of really weird to me, considering her character was such strong and cool and everything like that. But, least she does have sort of the idea of the travel and everything.
Hmm. Next, we get a new scene, which is a really interesting new scene. Iroh talks to Aang, and like Zuko's not here. So he's very respectful. He introduces himself, like, I'm the son of Fire Lord Azulon, that sort of thing. And Aang asks Iroh, why did the Fire Nation start the war? Iroh gives him quite a detailed answer here. He basically muses over the idea that some say like it's our nation's nature to expand and consume like fire. Others say that true stability can only be achieved under Fire Nation rule, and that conquest is in the aim of basically achieving peace and unity. Aang, of course, disagrees with this because like you're trying to achieve peace and unity through destruction. But Iroh notes that at this point, we're towards the end of the war. It only matters how to end the war, how we can actually achieve that, and that basically capturing you means the Fire Nation can now bring the war to an end and kind of end all of this. And Aang asks, like, and what about you? Like, do you believe that? Like, what's your take on this? But Iroh refuses to answer this question. So, very interesting one here, because it definitely makes sense, Iroh being very open with Aang, because he's never been really antagonistic towards him, really, even from the original. But it's nice that we have this kind of scene here where the thing I got from this is definitely that like older Iroh before he kind of becomes enlightened in a way. Why the Siege of Ba Sing Se sort of happens is this is Iroh's logic for that sort of stuff, but now he feels kind of differently about it after what's happened to Zuko and where things are now in the war. It's a very interesting scene that obviously gets into some quite complex things, because what he says at the start is effectively like Sozin's logic for starting the war as we know it from the original, that the Fire Nation's in a good place, so we want to expand and kind of in a way consume the other nations to achieve some sort of a peace under this enlightened nation style thing. But what are your thoughts on this new scene here with Iroh and Aang?
Yeah, it's definitely, I don't know. I think, it works in terms of what they're sort of going for in terms of making us, the viewer, and Aang sort of understanding the context or the certain, viewpoints that are at least currently there for sort of the reason behind the war and sort of what's going on. So it's another, it's just another scene to sort of fill Aang in on the goings of the world and to show us that, Arrow is a character that, even with his, sort of worst, or who's supposed to be the worst, enemy of the Fire Nation, he can still sort of be civil and have, some general sort of compassion with and, offer tea to them, right? Like that's sort of Iroh's big thing. So I like that they're, keeping that part of the character here pretty well as just showing, Aang's sort of, I guess sort of sneaky underhandedness in terms of, being able to set up, how he's going to sort of get out of the situation as well, right? So there's twofold for this little sort of scene here, even if it isn't, sort of the biggest one.
Yeah, there's some real quick scenes here, like Iroh leaves, Aang uses airbending to grab the keys. We cut to Katara and Sokka leaving, and Katara suggests that they basically take Appa instead, and they cut immediately to like Sokka's like, you won't get me on that, as they fly through the air. Then Aang then takes out Zuko's journal. He this is where he takes Zuko's journal for himself, because it has all of this information about the past avatars inside of it, and he doesn't really know how to be the avatar. He also gets his staff back here, and he makes a run for it. Zuko pursues, but Aang does manage to get away. Zuko kind of hits him from distance with a fire blast, and he falls out of the sky, but he's caught by Sokka, who's on Appa, of course. Zuko fires again, but this time Katara blocks it with water. So this is obviously a change. They don't do the Avatar state scene, but I'm very understanding of that. This is one of the weaker Avatar state scenes in terms of just what the Avatar state does with one of the other bending forms. So I don't mind them changing this at all. The only issue I'd have with this is Katara's block feels a bit weird just from a kind of logistics
Hmm.
point of view because they're pretty high up when it happens, and it's like that's a borderline like Avatar State almost style move to draw water up from that high. But other than that, like I get the idea. They wanted to have Katara have a waterbending move, basically to replace her freeze move, I suppose that would happen in the original instead. So, um, uh, fair enough overall. Like I think this is a nice adjustment given that they're not doing the big Avatar State scene. But your thoughts on the getaway scene?
Yeah, I had very similar thoughts in there. It's just sort of, they definitely feel like they sort of stretch some of the limits. I don't know. I wonder if it could have been like an ice ball or something else that would have done it. I mean, this is Qatar where she's not, she's still new to waterbending, right? So she doesn't have control. So I don't know if this was maybe one of the things where they're trying to be like, oh, she's like, she didn't understand what she was doing. So her bending was like, extra strong for whatever reason here. I don't I don't know if that's what they were going for here. It definitely doesn't feel like it quite fits. I mean, they're not that far from the water when you look at it sort of in context, but they're definitely feels like they're quite a bit of ways, and especially for someone who doesn't really know what they're sort of doing. I don't know. It's definitely odd the way that they sort of chose to go about this, but I think the escape scene overall I think is fine here. I think there's obviously changes like the way that it's just Zuko doing sort of the big sort of blast at the end, but I think they're trying to show that he has I don't. It feels like they're trying to show that Zuko is very sort of competent in his firebender, which I feel like they always sort of had that with him.
Mm.
It's just that he's just sort of like outclassed by his sister. So I don't know. I'm really curious if when that ever happens, that sort of comparison between the two of them.
Mm.
Um, but other than that, I think this is fine for Aang sort of figuring out how to escape and to be sort of like sneaky on his own and sort of get in the journal. I think it's interesting that this version of Aang doesn't really know anything at all about the Avatar, or he feels I don't know, he feels extra lost compared to say the one in the cartoon.
Mm.
So it's interesting to see that sort of comparison point, and that this journal that he took from Zuko is where he's getting like some of his sort of initial sort of knowledge and information from. It makes me wonder when if they ever do the thing when they're all on the same side, like how will that sort of dynamic work in terms of like the knowledge share there. But otherwise, it's cool
Hmm.
sequence.
Next up, we get a situation. They're on Appa and they realize, oh yeah, we can't go back home because the way they've done it here is that Katara and Sokka didn't have a grand scene where like it was the big goodbye, this is your destined journey, that sort of thing. So they still keep the plot point open of like they're they've just gone to save Aang. Not that they've left the tribe on their journey just yet. So there's a bit of a discussion here about like, well, we can't go back because we draw the Fire Nation back. So let's basically hang out somewhere for a little bit. So Aang decides that okay, we'll go to the Southern Air Temple because it's nearby, and we'll get to the addressing. Like okay, how true is what I've been told? So yeah, we pretty much quick cut here. Like they just straight up do travel time basically. We arrive at the Southern Air Temple. Obviously, it's abandoned. It's in ruins. There's is evidence, of course, of the Fire Nation attack. There's some armor around the place, and so Aang immediately makes his way to Yang Chen Shrine, of course now destroyed. Which, given what we learned in like the next episode, it makes sense because if the statue was still standing, Yang Chen probably could have been the first past life he actually talked to, but because the statue is destroyed, there's no glowy kind of stuff that happens here. So inside he finds Gyatso's kind of remains and is overcome by grief. The Avatar state activates. This, of course, threatens to hurt Katara and Sokka, as well as destroy it even more. And so they do this scene slightly differently. Well, quite a bit differently, actually. Instead of Katara and Sokka kind of calming down Aang down out of the Avatar state by basically highlighting that you may have lost like your people, but you have a new family, you have new friends, like it's not all lost for you. You can form kind of new connections in this time. Instead, they're just kind of trying to stay alive, and it's Aang in his own head remembering what Gyatso said to him in the past about how they'll always be friends, that he always kind of believed in Aang. Aang can kind of do more than this. So basically the idea, you have to snap out of this to keep going as the Avatar. I understand kind of why they maybe did this, but it also feels maybe a little bit kind of overthought, that some people brought up the idea of like, is it because it's so early? Would Katara and Sokka view him as family just yet? And is that why they made the change to do it like this? I've always liked that scene in 103, partly because it's clear that, this is this kind of destined kind of coming together of people. It is a team Avatar kind of formation, and that even if sure they don't know each other super closely just yet, it still works, it still hits, because the important thing is for Aang to have other people, because he doesn't want to be alone, and that the friendship will get to that point. I probably would have done maybe a little bit of a mix of the two if you had to edit it, where like it's partly Gyatso, but then Katara comes in and be like, hey, you have us as well. Maybe not going as far as the full-on family line just yet, but I don't like that they didn't attempt at all to kind of calm him down. I think that's my main thing here. It's still fine, but it's just little things to make it, I think, perfect. Is kind of my thoughts on it. Also, probably has to be noted, like, they really do rush through this part of 103. They don't really have a lot of time for Southern Air Temple, but I get to a certain degree you maybe didn't want to do the whole plot of 103 and hiding the information from Aang, but I would have liked a little bit more time to see this notable location, Aang seeing it again, that sort of thing. But what are your thoughts on this scene, the Avatar State scene, basically?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I definitely would have liked overall more time just to the location and everything, just for Aang's sort of sense here. But I don't know, the connection of them sort of being family or being some sort of intermediary between the two of them that sort of brings, Aang back down to earth here. I mean, I don't know. She does have sort of the whole sort of, understanding sort of hug sort of at the end of it. So I don't know. It feels like there's still, some connection there, even if it isn't automatically sort of like, where like your new family or that where, your new closest best friends or whatever. Because it feels like there's still, because there's still, some idea that maybe they're not going to be with him for like, the foreseeable future here. That I don't know, the fact that they did have this sort of instant connection didn't particularly bother me, and since they had the whole sort of flashback scene where we sort of already understand the idea of, how much Aang, sort of revered Gyatso as his friend and mentor and everything like that, and I guess sort of his, by extension, his people in general, that would be his stronger connection point than sort of the immediate people that he just met in this current time. And that might just be just because there's just not enough, runtime for us to sort of see and understand that. So that was the reason behind their sort of like taking out that sort of part there. Although it was nice in the original one, it definitely worked well. So, it's like, did you have to change it because it worked well before? But, they are trying to do something slightly different with the source material. So I don't know. I think in the context of here, it didn't really sort of bother me too much, even if it felt like it worked better in sort of the original one for me, per se. But otherwise, I think it, the way that they sort of showed it and display and how it was sort of pretty brutal here. So like her sort of, being able to sort of brave sort of the element there to actually sort of get in touch with him, that wouldn't have felt as sort of realistic to me if she was somehow able to sort of do that, especially with her not having, any sort of, bending prowess of her own to sort of brave that sort of storm there. So I don't know. For me, it worked more or less.
Mm-hmm. The visuals of this, I did find at various points during the Avatar State scene, Aang's face looked a bit like odd, and I'm like, did they CG some of his face during this scene? Like, I was really unclear about like is this just like some like odd facial expressions that he's doing to get across the power and emotion, or did they actually have to CG some stuff on his face? What are your thoughts on that? Because I'm really unsure about it, if it's just a weird lighting and stuff or what.
Yeah, no, I noticed that too as well. It's like, is it sort of like the compositing that they have on sort of the background that's sort of throwing it off there, or are they sort of changing the sort of proportions there to sort of emphasize sort of the mental state that is in there? Or is that just like one of those things where they just like ran out of time to make it look as good as they really wanted to because it was early on? I don't know. There's like so many things that could go into that sort of scene there, and I don't know. Maybe this was just one of those things of like not quite having the full, you know, Avatar state look figured out in the beginning, but it definitely does sort of stand out, especially compared to some of the other parts where it seems more or less sort of like okay.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I definitely don't know quite what's up with that one since it stands out so
hmm
much.
Next, Aang comes down at the Avatar state. Katara hugs him, and Aang has sort of like decided that he's going to do kind of what the monks wanted him to do, and that is master the elements, take up his role as the Avatar. And then we cut to Zuko, who draws an image of Aang, puts it up on his wall. He has his target, he has his hope, and this is kind of contrasted with Aang having his new friends here and now accepting that he is the Avatar and he's going to be on this journey. And that is basically how we end the opening episode there. Any thoughts on those kind of final quick fire scenes there at the end?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I guess, we get that they're now going to sort of stay together here, and this is sort of, I guess, the initial sort of idea of this sort of formation, right? Like you know, it's not everything yet. It's not as sort of set in stone as sort of the original one is, but there's, I don't, it feels like there's some, beginning understanding of, what they have to do and sort of that, Aang's going to have to fight for what he really wants to do in the future here. So I like that they at least have that beginning to come here and that sort of understanding here. And yeah, Zuko, he also has his target, right? And we can see that I don't know, it's cool to see that he's almost sort of like crazed in his sort of, tracking of the Avatar and stuff like that. So I don't know, it's interesting to see how this Zuko is acting.
hmm So yes, overall, I think this is probably one of the best episodes of the series, having seen them all, and I think that's kind of pretty universal among what I've seen. That the first episode especially is people quite like. Part of it is that it's probably the most like accurate to source material of like quite a lot of the episodes, but you can also tell it's also got a pretty nice blend of like a lot of the additional scenes actually do really work because you've got the big sequence that works quite nicely at the start, but then stuff like the Aang Iroh scene also is pretty good as well. And in the grand scheme of the show, like there's relatively like minimal kind of cuts that like I'd maybe have problems with, where like I did maybe feel going through it here that like Katara maybe gets some of her kind of scenes kind of taken away from her, and they're not maybe as heavily replaced with regards to like talking to Aang down in at the Southern Air Temple, some of the more emotional scenes, just to get across that she has that sort of like strong kind of will side to her as well. But otherwise, like I think they do everything pretty right, and I think especially if you had switched it to Aang actually running away, like you'd have a nearly like pretty like ideal first opening episode, but it's still I think really really good. But what are your overall thoughts on the first episode here?
Yeah, I think for me it worked pretty well. I think I came away with this feeling that this was pretty much in par with what, I think a sort of streamlined version of the first, couple episodes of the first season would be in terms of, how they're grounding things, how they're sort of, cutting things away, how they're sort of doing their characterizations while trying to keep them, mostly as we sort of know them and sort of what has worked so well for these characters in the past. Yeah, I think, I don't know if I, some of them, some of the parts sort of, I guess in retrospect, bother me a little bit in terms of sort of what they're trying to do with the characters in terms of like pitting them sort of against in terms of Aang sort of like running away and stuff like that, even though where they're trying to go with it in terms of this series, it feels like they're trying to make it fit in here. So that part, works for me in sort of isolation, I guess you could say. But overall, I think it's a fine opening episode. I think it's definitely worth watching for this and just sort of see how it's beginning to sort of set things up. So it worked for
Hmm.
me.
And then I suppose we probably should talk about like acting performances, who stands out to you. So yeah, of the characters we get to see in this opening episode, which characters do you think fit the role the best?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know. I think for the most part, most of the three main characters work for me, and Zuko as well. I mean, I don't. I think for the most part, they're all pretty in par with what I would think for these characters. Now, there are some changes, and those are more for the story and how they're sort of tweaking things and the overall story arc, I guess, of things. And those parts, I don't know. I think I might have to see more to see how I feel about them. But in terms of like the general sort of acting and everything like that, like I think this feels like they know the characters well enough to sort of put them on screen here and have them be pretty believable in terms of what they're trying to sort of achieve here. So no, I think most of them I think worked for me. I don't think I had any real issues with them, at least not as of
Hmm.
now.
Yeah, pretty similar. Like even after watching the whole series, I think most of the actors do a really good job at kind of portraying their characters. Um, I'd say maybe the standouts for me, like probably are like I think Ian does a really good job at Sokka. I think he actually does really capture the role very well. Even Gordon as like a one of the younger cast members doing the main character gets across all the emotion and stuff really well. Like I think we were pretty high praise for a lot of the early emotion scenes in the flashback, but then he has the good smile and the fun Aang scenes when they give those moments to him. Um, and everyone gets their chance to shine. Um, I don't think like what Gio and Tio has maybe got as much praise for Katara, but I think that's mainly just because they made some weird kind of writing choices, and I think it's more script than on acting for her. Where like I think she could do some of the bigger Katara emotional moments, but they have written the character to be a little bit like not as like vocal in some ways as the original Katara. So
Mhm.
it'll be interesting to see how how they kind of do that going forward. But yeah, like I would definitely struggle even across like all 8 episodes to pick out a character where I felt like, ooh, this didn't work. Like that's not performed like super well. I think they have that pretty spot on here, kind of throughout the whole thing, and outside of like minor bits and pieces where like yeah script stuff sometimes you don't help the actors, it's mostly I think very very good. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the opening episode here. Of course, we're going to devote a podcast to each episode kind of individually here, so we're not overly rushing through them. But yeah, that's been the N101 Aang review. So yeah, it's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye.